They are definitely using crude oil and especially the Indian import of crude oil from Russia as a leverage to extract concessions from India. Mind it, even after 5 rounds of talks between India and the United States, they have not been able to reach a trade agreement. Pakistan reached a trade agreement quite early with one of the lowest tariff regimen that the US granted to anyone. Of course, UK was 10%, some others were 15%, Pakistan was 19%. So that was one of the lowest that US agreed to. But in the Indian perception and the Indian position has been difficult and different, and the US and India have not come to a conclusion, and that is the reason that US is trying to use the import of Russian oil by India as a leverage. But to be fair, there have been many other issues as well confronting the Indo-US relationship. For instance, and you could see it, you could feel it, that India has been importing over the last 2-3 years about 1.7, especially last year or early this year, it has imported 1.7 million barrels a day. Now that is a significant, almost 30 to 40% of Indian oil is now coming from Russia. And why did India jump on it? There was a reason behind it. It was getting it at a concessional rate, at a discounted rate from the US, from Russia, because Russia had to sell it in a sanctioned environment, and India was a ready-made buyer to it. And that is the reason Russia was offering discounted rate to its buyers. India literally jumped on this opportunity, brought in 30 to 40% of its requirements from Russia. And then the interesting thing is that Ambani's refinery started to process it, convert it into different fuels, and then it was remarketing it mostly into Europe and even to the US. So that means through this channel, Russian oil was ultimately reaching Europe and the United States too. And mind it, Ambani and his team and the other Indian refineries were not selling to Europe and America at a discounted rate. They were selling at the market price from where they could have got from anywhere else in the world. So that was a point of irritation between the United States and India. But that was not at this point. While the United States and Russia are trying to reach a conclusion on Ukraine war, President Trump has been trying to use all the leverages at his disposal to put pressure on Russia. And oil was one of the major leverages that he had. So he was trying to push India to reduce import from Russia. India did not appear ready to it. And that was the reason this tariff discussion is going on and on without any conclusion between India and Russia. So that was one, and this was putting into jeopardy the entire Indo-US relationship, which has been burgeoning, which has been growing, flourishing for the last at least a decade and a half. Ever since, I remember when Vajpayee went to White House during Clinton era, if I'm not wrong, Clinton received him like a dad, like a son receiving his dad. He was taken into the White House, and the entire White House was flooded by the Indian diaspora present there. They were all welcomed into the White House. So that was the beginning of it, and then it continued and continued. What we call as the Howdy and Modi, sort of that relationship between Modi and President Trump. So that continued. Now that was in jeopardy. But that was not the only reason for it. In fact, one of the very evident sort of indication of the growing distance between India and Russia, India and the US was when President Trump indicated that while announcing their deal with Pakistan, that not only they have reached a deal with Pakistan, but the American companies, and most probably ExxonMobil, but is still to be announced, would be getting back into Pakistan to help Pakistan unearth its massive oil and energy resources. And then he teased India with a statement that maybe India may buy oil from Pakistan. So all this was not going well with the Indians. President Trump, at a point in time, also mentioned of the dead economy of India. Again, that was irritating Indians. Then a few months back, I think 6-8 months back, at the beginning of Trump era, the second era, that Indian personnel who had overstayed from their visa in the US were sent on military planes from the US to India with their hands and legs shackled. And India was horrified that this took place just days before Modi went to see Trump, seeking to stave off high tariffs. These were the factors that was already impacting the Indo-US relationship adversely. And then this was the last thing, the continued import of Russian oil, which, as I mentioned earlier, was 1.7 million barrels a day, roughly speaking. So that was the last thing. And that made Trump announce an additional 25% duty on Indian imports from India. So taking it to one of the highest in the world. Now, and that would be effective from August 27. And it would come to be 50%. So this was the last nail in the coffin of between India and US relationship. It has been going on for 3 years, although the volumes were initially lesser. Now it is reaching 1.7 million barrels a day, as I say. Initially, it was thought that this is important to keep the global oil balance in the right shape, and there is and to avoid any scarcity or tightening of the markets, because despite everything, Americans wanted Russian oil to stay in the market. Had there been no Russian oil, markets would have been tightened to a very great extent, and that would have resulted in the global surge in market prices. So that was the reason that initially, for last 2-3 years, both Europe and the United States, despite the US-led sanctions on Russian oil, they literally closed their eyes on this business. But things changed until the Biden government. Biden and his administration was pretty cool in that sense. They did not want to disturb the Indo-US relationship. That was of prime importance to them. But with the advent of the new administration of Trump in the early this year, things began changing. And the first thing that Trump was not at all very strong against Russia, was not seen taking a hard line against Russia and even against China. So the policy, there has been a change in policy once Trump came into power in White House early this year. So that meant that also made sure that the Trump administration also kept its eyes closed on this growing relationship. But, and in the meantime, it reached to this current level, which is one of the highest in recent years. But over the last 15, 20 days or a month, there was a sort of realization in the US that President Putin is not ready to budge from his stated position. Now, that was irritating to President Trump, who has been saying initially that once he gets into power, the Ukraine-Russia war would come to an end immediately. That did not turn out to be the real issue. Ever since he took over power on January the 20th, and the war is still going on. It has not come to a conclusion. So initially he put pressure on Ukraine, but that did not end in the war because there was a feeling growing in that Russia was not ready to give in from its own position. And that resulted in a sort of situation within the US and within the Trump administration that Russia needs to be pressurized as well. So that was the reason that additional pressure needed to be put on Russia. And from where that additional pressure would come, one of the leverage that President Trump and his team had was to use the sanction leverage against Russia to ensure that Russian oil exports get to a lower level and to ensure that the Russian earning from crude sales gets down to a lower level. The reason was apparent that everyone knew that this oil earnings were helping Russia continue this war against Ukraine. So now, in order to pressurize Russia, there was a feeling that we need to squeeze out the oil earnings of Russia. And that is the reason additional sanctions and the pressure on India. And there are expectation that if this thing continues, there could be pressure on China as well to reduce imports from Russia. So that apparently, the change in thinking perhaps contributed to this additional pressure on India, plus of course the other things that were already becoming an irritant between the relationship of the two countries. The issue is that of course that would help. And there are hints from India, although there are confusing hints. On one end, they are saying that they are not going to buy. Indians are saying that they are not ready to change their position. They will continue to buy. But there are, at the same time, there are some reports that India has secured some 22 million barrels for delivery in the next couple of months from non-Russian sources. And that was, in a sense, giving in to the US pressure. So that was there. But there were other irritants also, as I mentioned earlier, in the Indo-US relationship. Now, those are not easy to be removed. So all in all, the sort of relationship that began to flourish ever since Clinton era and perhaps even earlier, and it reached a peak in Modi era, in Trump's first tenure, and it was expected to continue in Trump's second tenure as well. That is a big question mark, that would it ever reach back to those levels? There is a growing murmur in the diplomatic circles that even if this irritant is taken off, even if India starts buying from other countries, perhaps Indian-US relationship would not go back to the levels it had reached about a year earlier. So it has already taken a hit. President Putin and President Trump are going to see each other in Alaska next Friday. Now that is a very interesting move. Now suppose Russia and the US reach some conclusion, although there are hiccups into that. There's no point in going into those details. But if President Putin and President Trump reached some sort of agreement on ending the war on Ukraine, the Russian war on Ukraine, that could mean that the pressure on Russian oil exports, pressure by the US on Russian oil exports would go down. And that could also mean that the Indian imports of Russian oil may not stay a big irritant in the Indo-US relationship. Now that would be a very interesting thing to emerge, that okay, oil does not remain a big irritant. India may import from Russia if it wants, but then what? But as I mentioned, and there are so many other issues that have emerged that the relationship has taken a big hit. And there are people in Washington who have started to complain about it, that we are not doing the right, we have done a big damage to Indo-US relationship. And one of them is John Bolton, the previous national security advisor to President Trump in his first era, who was also the representative into the UN at a point in time. He warned that whatever has been done, the sort of hit that India-US relationship has taken is not the right thing to happen. But to be fair, the relationship has taken a hit, and it would be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to take that relationship back into the levels it was until the beginning of this Trump new era. It has shifted the trajectory, yes. It would help, it would take off one of the irritants and one of the major irritants, to be fair. Oil, in recent days and weeks, oil has become the oil imports of India from Russia has become a major irritant in relationship between the US and India. That would be taken off in case, and that is still to be decided, is still to be seen, that whether US and Russia reach an agreement. But in case reach an agreement, the sanctions are lifted, India would be free to buy it from Russia. But the trajectory perhaps will not change, as I just mentioned. It would stay on the same line. There are so many irritants, so many things happening. The tariff deal has not been signed. India has always been a very protective sort of economy. India may not allow imports of US goods in the same manner as President Trump and his team wants. So there are major other irritants, and that perhaps that would result in that the trajectory would not stay the same as it was until the beginning of the Trump era, the second Trump era early this year.